The last thing that we want to concern ourselves with is examining a variable's variability, how it appears across the different values or categories that make up the variable, in and of itself, and across different groups. One way of looking at how a variable is distributed across those values or categories is with what we call a box plot, sometimes called a box and whiskers. There's more than one way to execute a box plot. The first way we've already discussed, and that was through the explore function. So if I go up to the menu bar and choose Analyze, from the drop-down menu I choose Descriptive Statistics, and then I roll to the right and go 3 down to the Explore function. Box plots are best used with interval and ratio level variables and can be useful with ordinal variables that have a lot of values. But if it has very few values, a box plot isn't too informative, and we want to avoid using a box plot when you have nominal level data. It's just not useful for interpretation. So in this instance, let's go down to hours per day and move that to the dependent list. All right, hours per day watching television. We've already dealt with this variable in this lesson. We're familiar with it. And then we'll go to Statistics button in the top right hand corner of the dialog box. We want to make sure that descriptives is checked. That's the default. Go to plots. Usually I want to check a histogram. Click continue. And then choose options. And click continue. We'll leave it at the default settings. Click OK. From earlier, we know that the first box tells us how many cases were examined. The descriptive statistics such as the mean and the standard deviation and the interquartile range are reported here. And we want to take note of the interquartile range being 2. So we're going to scroll down. Take note of the histogram. It's a highly skewed distribution to the right, or positive skew. It's leptokurtic, very peaked at the low end. Scroll down a little further. We see a stem and leaf plot, which is essentially a histogram inverted on the side. And then we come to the box plot. A box plot, or a box and whiskers plot, is named so because it displays certain information about variability. The center box is defined by Q3 as this top line here. Q1 is the bottom line, and then there's a heavy dark line, which is the median, or Q2. In this instance, Q2 and Q1 are the exact same value, which means people are clustered together at value 2. Recall that the mode and the median were 2 and the average was 2.89. So all this is showing is that there's a lot of scores clumped together or clustered together at 2. These whiskers indicate the length from Q3 to almost Q4. Actually, this is a trimmed model, where like the last 5% is left off, and these values are considered extreme values. Notice there are no extreme values at the low end, and so this is actually Q0, the start point, and the length to Q1, which was 2. So remember the interquartile range was 2, so this means this is 2, and this value is 4, and so 50% of the values are between 2 and 4 hours a day of watching TV. And those are the centrally located values. And that jibes with what we saw earlier. The mean was 2.89. The standard deviation was 2.1. And so most people for one standard deviation range fell between 0.7 and 5. And so that the middle 50% fall between 2 and 4. So this is an example of a box and whiskers plot for one variable. We can also use a box and whiskers plot for a variable like hours per day watching TV across several different categories. And we can do that with a graph. So if I go to the graph option in the menu, scroll down to the legacy dialogues, and when I roll to the right, I choose the box plot option. I just want to make sure simple is should be the default selection, then click define. So in this instance, I'm going to stick with hours per day watching TV as my dependent variable. So I click it from the variable list and I move it to the variable box. And I'm looking for the category axis now. So what groups do we want to compare? So in this instance, let's compare marital status. And we'll move that to the category axis. And then just click OK. So what we're examining here is the variability of hours per day watching TV across the different groups. And so notice that each group has its own box and whiskers plot, right, with different box lengths. Notice the medians, the heavy dark lines, are at different places for each group. So for instance, the median value for married is much lower than the median value for separated. It looks like the median value is highest for the separated group. And it looks like never married, divorced, and married may have about the same median. The black lines appear to be going across the same place. Notice that the lower whisker for all of them tends to go all the way to 0, but the upper bound whisker is different for some. For instance, married stops at about 6 or 7. The same for the divorce group, or maybe even lower. But notice that the other three groups have much higher whiskers, meaning the upper 25% go even further out to these values, whereas the upper 24% or 20%, right, these are the outliers, the extreme scores of each group that don't fit in well with all the others. So what we're seeing here is most of the scores for the married group, because of the distance between the bottom of the lower whisker and the top of the upper whisker, is much more compressed compared to, say, the widowed group, the separated group, and the never married group. Right? So from endpoint to endpoint, the married group is much more clustered together. Additionally, the length from Q3 to Q1, the length of this box is much shorter compared to, say, the widowed group or the separated group. So because endpoint to endpoint, the whiskers are shorter, and the box is also a shorter height or shorter length, we would say that the married group has the least amount of variability. Whereas it's up for debate about which groups have the most variability. From endpoint to endpoint, each of these three can have a case made, but when you look at the box lengths, they appear to be in different places, but about the same length. And so you could debate about which of these three has the most variability.